the ideas of labor and wages. And let me just point out to you what is the present crisis. And when I'm talking about the present crisis, I'm not just talking about COVID 19. I'm talking about the situation before COVID 19. So if you let's just think about what was the state of affairs before COVID 19. The employment situation in India has been very precarious, and the wages have been extremely low. In other words, I mean, one can argue that there was an employment crisis pre COVID 19. But what happened during COVID 19, because lockdown was enforced, it worsened the situation, and in particular, the case of migrant workers. And this really meant that the employment crisis was brought to the fore. Now everybody could see it very clearly. Now, in this situation, what can economists do? I'm thinking that there are two things which economists can work on or focus on. One is short-term policies. What policies can be adopted to tackle the present crisis? But on the other hand, there's also an important aspect, which is how do we think about employment in the long term? So it is in that context that I'm going to talk today. I'm going to talk about how economists conceptualize labor, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about how it is connected to the teaching of economics. Again, let me just motivate my discussion today. One could ask, why should I go into a conceptual exploration? And the reason for that, at least I take this from what Keynes said. Let me just read out this quote, that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Right? In other words, I mean, often there are many policies that are being undertaken, but sometimes we are not clear what the origins of these ideas are. And I've just given the covers of two books here. If you're interested in knowing more about Keynes's work, you can consult these two books. Another reason for why I'm undertaking a conceptual exploration, and this quotation I've taken from a work of Joan Robinson, and I just want to focus on the last sentence in this quotation. And the purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. And now, the reason for putting this quote is to, again, to motivate today's discussion, where I'm going to talk about two different ways of understanding labor. And I think it will become clear to you why it is important to have a critical perspective. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the discussion as such, and I'm going to begin by posing the question: why do we have policy suggestions such as the following to increase employment? I mean, this has happened even in the past. For instance, during the Great Depression, that economists or some economists argued that if you want to increase employment, all you have to do is lower wages. That is one option. The other option that is often suggested is relax labor laws, give more freedom to employers to hire and fire workers. Where are these policy suggestions coming from? Now, let me get into the theory aspect of it. The key assumption that we are going to make throughout this presentation is we are going to talk about a competitive economy. And this is an economy where you have free mobility of labor and capital. And in reality, this is not the case, but this is the conceptual framework that we are going to be looking at. And the second question, or not the second question, this is the first question. Will the free market forces ensure the full employment of labor? Now that we have assumed a competitive economy, can we say that the market forces will ensure that everybody who is looking to work will find work at the prevailing wage rate? Now, if the answer is yes, if the answer is that market forces will ensure the full employment of labor, then we should have policies which aim to make the market forces freer. Right? And that is the context in which I'm going to carry out the subsequent discussion. But before I enter that, I want to point out that there are two broad schools of thought. There are many others, but I'm going to focus on two schools of thought today. One, which is a mainstream school of thought, which is what most of us are familiar with. This is also called marginalist economics. The reason for calling it marginalist economics is because it uses concepts like marginal utility, marginal product, marginal revenue, marginal cost, and things like that. This is also sometimes called neoclassical economics. And some of the key economists in this school of thought are Walras, Marshall, Pigou, Samuelson, Solow, Nordhaus. Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize just last year. Mankiw, who is the author of a famous, textbook. There's also what we call heterodox economics, that is, economics which is in opposition to mainstream economics. Within heterodox economics, there are various schools. I'm going to talk particularly about classical economics today, but there are other schools like post Keynesian economics, old institutional economics, and Marxian economics. And within classical economics, some of the people who have contributed to this area is Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Sraffa, Pierangelo Garignani, and Krishna Bharadwaj. Krishna Bharadwaj is an Indian economist, and she used to teach at JNU. Very often when I've made this presentation elsewhere, people have asked me, is this what is classical economics? Because although here I've mentioned classical economics are referring to these economists, there is often a huge confusion because when you study mainstream economics textbooks, they say that first there's an introduction, then there is classical economics, then there is Keynesian economics. The way in which these textbooks characterize classical economics is of a chronological nature. So anything before Keynes is considered to be classical economics. And this was also the definition or the classification that Keynes adopted. But that is not the way in which I am going to talk about classical economics. I'm going to talk about classical economics as having a very distinct conceptual framework. Right? So my distinction of classical economics or my definition of classical economics is based on their conceptual framework, and it is not based on chronology. Okay, now let me get into the conceptual matter. So we all know that marginalist economics, you've all learned about demand and supply. And within this, you have this notion of a schedule. Right? You have this idea of a schedule. You have demand schedule and supply schedule. What I want to point out here, and maybe ask you to think further, is it is quite commonsensical to us to think that there is some sort of an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. In general, we think that okay, when the price decreases, we are going to buy more of that product. That is a very common, maybe a general understanding. But to go from there, which is a very common understanding, to the idea of a schedule is a huge jump. Right? A schedule or a functional form in microeconomics has very strong restrictions and assumptions. So I think that is something that one needs to think about. The second point is that in marginalist economics, supply and demand are seen as opposing forces or balancing forces. And Marshall said that this was like a pair of scissors, the hands of a pair of scissors. So there is this idea of symmetry that is there in marginalist economics. The third point is labor is understood on par with capital, especially when you talk of factors of production. So there's no way in which you think that maybe capital is much more powerful than labor or labor has more power than capital. And how labor and capital is understood is also very similar to how final outputs are understood. For instance, the demand and supply of, let's say, an apple and demand and supply of labor is seen to be very similar. The mechanisms are very similar, and what you have is demand and supply operating. Right? So the mechanisms that determine equilibrium in the case of an apple, it is the same in the case of labor too. Now let's just take this I think that most of you know this, and there's nothing new that I'm saying here, but I'm just asking you to think a bit more critically about some of these things that we have studied. So demand and supply schedules, in this case, what it tells you is that there is an upward sloping supply curve and there's a downward sloping demand curve. And at equilibrium, basically we have a full employment equilibrium. And you are also given the equilibrium wage rate. Now let's take a look at how supply and demand are understood in classical economics. There is no notion of a schedule in classical economics. Instead, what you have are proportions. This is in particular to Adam Smith. I'm making this point. And in Adam Smith, there is this term called effectual demand. And effectual demand is understood as a point. So when they talk about prices, they're talking, when they talk about the quantity that is brought to the market, they're talking about that quantity, which is a single point or a scalar relative to the effectual demand, which is another point. Right? So we're just talking about points, and there is no idea of a schedule. The second important aspect here is the idea of asymmetry. In classical economics, there is no notion that supply and demand are balancing forces. There is no notion of symmetry. Instead, what you have is the idea of asymmetry. In particular, the idea that in some sense the supply adapts to the effectual demand. So this is one particular characterization which I've taken from this article by Garigiani, which was published in 1998. This is just to indicate that you can have a visual representation of these points and proportions in classical economics as well. The N in this graph refers to the natural price. I've not really explained these things, but if one is interested, we can always discuss it towards the end. But this is just to indicate to you that we can understand supply and demand as points or as proportions. And point E refers to the effectual demand. Now let's go a little bit more further. So when you think of labor and wages in marginalist economics, we try to think in two ways. What is happening with the workers? What is happening with the firms? So we start by thinking in terms of an individual worker. An individual worker supplies labor, and this labor supply is determined by this labor leisure calculation. Right? How much of labor do I prefer over leisure, or how much of leisure do I prefer over labor? There is some sort of adjustment that one is making, and this is very similar to this utilitarian idea which was proposed by Jeremy Bentham, where he spoke about the pain and pleasure calculus. So labor is understood to be a pain and leisure is understood to be pleasure. Right? It's a very similar kind of formulation. Now let's take a look at the individual profit maximizing firms. These individual profit maximizing firms, they are the ones who demand labor. They demand labor until the wage equals the marginal product of labor. So that is the condition, and that's also the equilibrium condition. So you have wage equals the marginal product of labor, and R, or the rate of profit, equals the marginal product of capital. What are the assumptions that one is making here? One is making the assumption that labor and capital are freely substitutable. Right? They can be substituted for each other. And the implication of this assumption of substitutability is the following, and this is very important, that at higher wages, you have a lower demand for labor. At higher wages, you have a lower demand for labor. And remember the question that I posed in the very beginning. Why do economists argue that if you want to increase employment, you just need to lower wages? Part of the reason is coming from this kind of idea that marginalist economics puts forth and communicates in textbooks and university syllabuses and all that. The next aspect here is the law of diminishing marginal productivity. And in the short run, you assume that the other factor is fixed. And in the long run, there is an assumption that all factors are fully employed. Right? So if you want to increase production, because of the assumption of full employment, you can only do it by increasing prices. So that was marginalist microeconomics as such. But when we study labor economics, what we are studying is a particular version of labor economics which comes from these marginalist principles. So, and here we talk about two things. One is the movement along the curve. What happens to labor demand when you have a change in wages? Then we also talk about what happens to shifts in the labor demand curve. Right? How does the labor demand curve shift? And that is dependent on these following factors. One of them is that it is a derived demand. That is, the labor demand is dependent on the demand for final products. Labor productivity has a role to play. There's a relative cost of capital, which also has a role to play. Employment taxes or subsidies, right? So subsidies and taxes also play a role. But what are two things which are peculiar or characteristic of this kind of or this way of thinking? One is that for marginalist economics, their prices or value is determined by what is called endogenous distribution. Now, what do I mean by that? That wages are completely determined from within the model. So wages and the rate of profit are completely determined within the model. So this is a particular representation and it's called value through endogenous distribution. So there is no role for other factors, right? So the second important characteristic of this kind of thinking is that marginalist economics is always thinking at the margin. So you're saying what happens at the margin, and this is why we are interested in knowing what is the marginal utility, what is the marginal product, what is the marginal cost. And but again, there is no reason to believe or to think that this is the only way of thinking about economics. And this is not the only way about thinking about economics, is the point that I will be making. But there are very many ways of thinking about how to understand our economic surroundings. And this is just one particular way of thinking about it. So, what is the policy implication? So, uh, of marginalist microeconomics and what is the policy implication? It is very clear from here that suppose the workers decide that we want to set up a union and let's ask for a higher wage because we think that it is necessary to have a higher wage. The argument is that if the effect of a unionization is that it leads to unemployment. So if you look at the x-axis here, there is excess supply of labor, right? So unionization is bad from the point of view of employment in the society. Now let me contrast this with labor and wages in classical economics. According to classical economists, wages are determined by broader forces or broader factors. Wages are determined by what workers at one point in time think that what is necessary. So this is determined by culture, by social factors. It also depends on the social reproduction of the workers. And for instance, Adam Smith argues that so wages should include the cost for educating the children too. Right? So it's a social idea of how wages are determined. And there is no formula in which you can reduce it to some demand and supply and say this is how wages should be determined. And that's not how wages are determined. In other words, for classical economics, no mechanistic explanation can be provided for wage determination. It has to be historical, it has to be sociological. And who are the main thinkers in classical economics? I'm talking about people like Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and Sraffa. And this way of thinking about wages has been characterized as value through exogenous distribution, right? So distribution is exogenously determined by history and social factors. And in this approach or in this paradigm, there is no thinking at the margin. So there is no idea of marginal product, marginal utility, etc. And maybe I can mention one historical fact here. It is true that in Ricardo, you have marginal product of land, right? Or marginal returns to land, but that is only particular to or diminishing productivity with respect to land. That is only with respect to land. But in marginalist economics, this notion of returns to land or diminishing returns to land got extended to all factors of production. Again, that is something that people can work on for their projects if you're curious about it. So again, if you're interested in knowing more about labor and wages from a classical approach, I would strongly recommend these two books. One is a book which is called Social Reproduction, and the other is a book which is called The Theory of Wages in Classical Economics. And both these books were published in the 1990s. So now let me again go back and ask this question again. Why does lowering wages increase employment? And I think part of the reason is the uncritical marginalist economics education. In other words, the kind of education that is imparted, which is uncritical, can tend or can make people think that lowering wages will actually increase employment. Right? And this idea that happens in an individual market is extended to the economy as a whole. So you understand the labor market as a summation of all these individual markets. And so you have this idea of the economy as a whole. What about the market for labor? I mean, you have the notion of upward sloping supply of labor, and people can make some modifications, and you also have the backward bending labor supply schedule. Apart from the upward sloping supply of labor schedule, we've also seen that you have a downward sloping demand for labor schedule. This is for the economy as a whole. Right? This was the case for the individual market as well. This is also the case for the economy as a whole when we are talking about labor market as a whole. And we are saying in this labor market as a whole, what we are able to explain or what it tells us is equilibrium wages and labor employment. And equilibrium, remember, in this way of thinking is also understood as market clearing. That is, there is full employment of labor. And I think that at this point, let me again just, probably give you something to think about. If you have seen how wages are determined around you, you will realize that even the idea of the labor market for the economy as a whole is a huge abstraction, is a big abstraction. Right? So you have individual labor markets. Caste often has a role to play. Gender often has a role to play. There are so many other social factors which play a role. Right? So how can we aggregate all of these things actually and then talk about this homogeneous labor market itself is something to think about. So this is so what we did now is I moved from microeconomics to macroeconomics, but marginless macroeconomics. So what is the policy implication of marginless macroeconomics? So this is the aggregate labor market. Let's say that you impose a minimum wage. So governments impose minimum wages because they think that this is what is appropriate. So if you have a minimum wage, as you can see below the x-axis, what you arrive at is you have jobs which are lost. Right? So in other words, minimum wage legislation from from a marginalist macroeconomics point of view is a bad legislation because it leads to lost jobs. There is an extension of this marginless macroeconomics, and I just want to take you through that a little bit. And this comes in the form of what is called New Keynesian macroeconomics, which is the most dominant form of macroeconomics today. I think if you look at America or any other parts in journals and in textbooks, this is the most dominant form. This is a marginalist reading of Keynes, which is perpetuated by textbooks. So the focus is on the following. You focus on imperfections. And what are these imperfections? These imperfections could be sticky wages, it could be sticky prices, sticky interest rates. Right? So you have some imperfections. It could be because of imperfect information. Right? So you say that you have all these imperfections that are there, and unemployment is a consequence of these imperfections. In other words, unemployment arises from an obstruction of the market mechanism. Whereas Keynes, and the classical economists would argue that unemployment is a consequence of the market mechanism. Right? So remember that these are very, very different things. The new Keynesian macroeconomics argues that unemployment arises from an obstruction of the market mechanism, whereas classical economics and Keynes would argue that unemployment is a natural consequence of the market mechanism. Now, these are some of the extensions that marginalist macroeconomics takes, and maybe some of you would have studied these things. I'm just going to quickly go through them, but not really spend too much of time on it. One is you talk about the natural rate of unemployment. Again, what is underlying all this is this some notion of misinformation, or in some ways, imperfect information. There is again arguments about what is called, there is a search theory of cyclical employment that says that if you take workers by surprise, you can have some sort of positive impact. But in the long run, they have no impact. So this particular group or this particular frame of thinking argues that unemployment insurance is a bad idea. There are other theories, some of the names that I've mentioned here, I mean, Phillips curve or efficiency wage theories and all that, they're all extensions of marginalist macroeconomics. Let me just quickly go through some of that in visual form. So if you, again, efficiency wage is not about the economy as a whole, but it's probably better described with respect to sectors or industries. Again, if you have an efficiency wage, they try to explain unemployment by recourse to efficiency wage. You have unemployment because your wages are higher than the equilibrium wage. And this is because of imperfections in the market. So again, remember when we are talking about imperfections, we have moved away from the assumption of a perfectly competitive economy. This is insider-outsider models. Again, if wages are set by insiders, then you can have the possibility of permanent unemployment. And this is because of some sort of a power relation given by people who are inside the, these particular industries or inside the job market and people who are outside. Sorry. Yeah. So now let me just conclude and make a few points here. I've gone through different kinds of theories and I've also showed you the policy implications. I've tried to argue that the dominant view that in order to increase employment, we have to reduce wages or we have to make labor market more freer. My argument has been that it arises from our uncritical view of marginalist economics. Now, let me just try to point in one slide what are their differences and something like a summing up. Marginalist economics starts from the fundamental unit of analysis for marginalist economics is the individual. In macroeconomics, this individual is just seen to be aggregated and you have the idea of aggregated, or you believe that the macro behaves exactly the same as an individual. And this is known as methodological individualism. Classical economics, on the other hand, adopts what is called methodological holism. For them, they don't look at individuals, they look at social classes. So they think that workers as a particular distinct unit or capitalists as a particular distinct unit. And these are two different ways of understanding the world. But unfortunately, the issue is that when you study, for instance, in microeconomics, you're only introduced to methodological individualism. You're not introduced to methodological holism. Marginalist economics also, one of the characteristics is the endogenous distribution. And this is given by the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, which states that in equilibrium, your wage equals the marginal product of labor. Whereas in the case of classical economics, distribution is exogenous, and therefore there is a role for history and other forces. Marginalist economics takes this very commonsensical notion of an inverse relationship into a mathematically sophisticated schedule, which then gives us the downward sloping labor demand curve. And this has a lot of role to play in how we think about employment policy. In classical economics, there is no such monotonic inverse relationship between the wage rate and the demand for labor. For marginalist economics, there is no tendency to unemployment under perfect competition. But you can have unemployment, temporary unemployment, if there are imperfections in the economy or imperfections in the market. So then the solution in a way is you want to remove the imperfections. How do you remove imperfections? You create more markets. That's the policy solution that emanates from marginalist economics. In classical economics, there is a tendency towards unemployment under conditions of competition. So then what are the kind of policy implications at a very broad level? Marginalist economics, in some sense, would be against minimum wage and unionizing, as I've shown you the graphs. Whereas for classical economics, employment and labor issues are social aspects and they require active policies, whether it is minimum wage or when we are talking about politics, I'm referring to things like collective bargaining or unionizing. All these are important and they have to play a role. So here I've just listed some of the references that I've used to make some of the arguments here. And you can consult them if you're interested in reading more about these issues. So this was a figure drawn by one of my students some years ago. But what it basically conveys is what I tried to tell you by Joan Robinson's quote in the very beginning. It is that if you have to understand other ways of thinking about your economic surroundings, it is often a struggle because our standard economics textbooks or our Econ 101 courses are often very marginalist in nature. Right? And so, as Keynes would say, that you have to struggle to escape from these conventionally known ideas and views. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Is it audible?
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex, for this wonderful lecture. And if you are interested, we can have some discussions.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So we can ask the audience to have some questions if they want to ask Dr. Alex. Any of your students, participants, if they are interested, they can ask some questions related to classical economics and other things if they are interested.
Yeah, so there's a question from. So when I'm talking about social and historical factors, I mean, I think two examples, or one example would be even today there is a difference between wages that are paid to men and women for the same kind of work. Some of the wage gap has narrowed, but that is mainly because of several movements and several women's movements or feminist movements that have tried to indicate this. There have been wage gaps for the kind of labor. So people have tried to, for instance, let's say between nurses and doctors. Why is there such a huge wage gap? But people have tried to assert that this is not fair. So there is a notion of fairness, which is coming from a larger notion of how we want the society to be. And these are things which cannot be reduced to any graph or any formula. And they have to be something which is much more collective and much more social. Yeah, okay. So for instance, if you're talking about effectual demand in classical economics, and in particular to Smith, he would say that that is a point, but which is given outside this, the system that we are trying to understand, because there are several factors which affect it. But supply is something, there is quantity that is brought to the market, but both of those are individual points. Right? So that is the key distinction. The notion of a schedule is something that we are trained to think because of marginalist economics. And I think that I think I will leave, of course, these slides are already recorded, but you can always go to the reference that I mentioned there and to get a deeper discussion or a deeper description of the diagram. I think that might be better.
Any other questions from the participants? One more question is there, I think.
I think that's a comment about.
Nilesh.
Yeah. Okay. The question is, why do we have assumptions at all? See, for any kind of theorizing or any kind of modeling, it is necessary to have assumptions because, well, we are talking about a big system and we need to say that, okay, there are some relevant things. There are some things which we are going to keep aside. It is the same reason, although we see so many things happening around us, we have distinguished it into natural sciences, social sciences. Within social sciences, we have distinctions like economics, sociology, politics, history, etc. But all that we are saying is when we are studying economics, we are trying to say that let's keep other things constant for a while. We are not saying that they're not important, but we don't know much about it. Right? So it depends on how you think or what your question is. So here the problem is if wages are fundamentally a socially determined magnitude, but economists have tried to say that or have tried to reduce wages into an entirely economic notion. And then when you look at policy making, when you look at policy making, who gets to decide our wage policy? Who gets to decide employment policy? So I'll ask that in a separate way, or I'll pose the question to you. So, for instance, how many historians, or how many political scientists, or how many sociologists, or women studies scholars are there in policy making with respect to employment and wages, relative to economists, and that to marginalist economists? Right. So these things play a role like that, and I think these assumptions are important, but it is important also for us to understand where they come from. It is also important for us to check whether they make sense in our current context. If they don't make sense, how can we modify them and not to trust them blindly? So the question is it okay to decide economic policies based on the marginal concepts? See, I have a personal answer to it or a personal understanding, but I think, I don't want to tell you what I think, but what I would like you to do is actually think about what are the problems with those ideas, right? What are the problems with marginal concepts, but also explore other schools of thought within economics, which gives a different answer. So try to, so I've given you two schools of thought, but I'm asking you to make the choice. So you can also look at other schools of thought. Right? Engage with those ideas, also read sociology, read anthropology, find out what are the limitations in our own ways of thinking.
Okay. Thank you for your such a wonderful session, Dr. Alex. So topic and the material was very interesting, and discussion was also truly inspiring also. And so Dr. Alex has given a wonderful idea and how the wages have origin from the classical school to neoclassical and the Keynesian school. So he has given a brief idea and how the theories have origin and the basic the foundations also he has explained. So it was a very useful for the students and the faculties of the Akal universities and other universities those who are joined. And first of all, I will thank our speaker, Dr. Alex Thomas, for giving an inspiring lecture to the students of Akal University. And next is I thank our Vice Chancellor, sir, for providing us the opportunity. And I also thank our PRO and the IT department, Mr. Pradeep, sir, for providing us the assistant and their services. And I thank my department colleagues, students for their support. Last but not the least, the audience. Without them, this session would not be a success. I once again thanks the speaker and the audience for joining us the session. Thank you, Alex, for coming and joining us.
Thank you so much, to you and everyone else who ensured that this could happen.
We would like to continue these sessions in coming years on the next period also. So it would be like to you to be joining us. Okay. So wonderful. Thank you.